Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video. In this video we're back with another Survivor What If video. In this one we'll be talking about what if a public vote decided the winner of the show, essentially Russell Hance's dream, where the audience of the show gets the sole vote to decide the winner of every season. Kind of similar to the current BBAU format, where the rest of the game plays out the same, but once we get to Final Tribal, the public decides between the people that make it there. And while there are some very easy answers here, I do feel like there's also some pretty difficult ones. So again, it'll be fun to run through these. Again, running through all 41 seasons of the show up until this point. And let's start off with Survivor Borneo, where this is one of the easy ones. Again, Rich versus Kelly. We know Kelly would win this. I mean, there were public votes even at the time of who should win, to which Kelly won those. There was a basic popularity poll where Kelly was above Richard on all those as well. So again, to me, this is a very clear-cut one. I do think the public would have voted for Kelly. Next up, we have Survivor the Australian Outback, where again, I think we have another pretty clear-cut one. Again, Tina versus Colby. I do think Colby wins a public vote here. Now, I feel fairly confident in this. Obviously, Colby was a massive figure even outside the show at that point, to the point where people are naming their kids after him. Again, like to me, I think Colby was so popular at the time that I just can't imagine him losing a vote here. Next up, we have Survivor Africa, where we have Ethan versus Kim Johnson. This is another pretty clear-cut one where, again, I do think Ethan clearly wins this. Again, he was portrayed very heroic on his season. He was definitely another person that was very well liked on his season. And while his popularity never got to Colby levels, I do feel like against Kim Johnson, I find it very tough to believe that he would lose a public vote. So I do think he would win this one. Next up, we're up to the first really difficult one, and that is Survivor MARQUESAS with Vecepia versus Nalia. And I actually don't really know who wins this one. I think this is a pretty difficult one to put together, where neither of these two were particularly popular at the time. Again, if Kathy had gotten to the end, I do think Kathy easily wins. I do think if Pascal had gotten to the end, I think there's an argument for him winning at the time. I think with Nalia and Vecepia, I do think it is a bit tough. However, I would give the edge to Nalia. I mean, Nalia was very much in this mold of Elizabeth Filarski, who was very popular at the time. And while Nalia definitely did not reach that level of popularity, I really just don't see Vecepia winning a public vote back in 2002, especially considering how quiet her edit ends up being towards the end stretch of the season there in comparison to Nalia, who I think was a more prominent figure on the show at that point. And yeah, I do think people liked her relationship with Pascal, so I do think I would lean towards Nalia, but again, it's definitely not clear cut. Next up, we have Survivor Thailand. This is another very difficult one between Brian and Clay, and I think Clay wins, but I'm not really sure. Again, this is a time where gameplay was still not really as well respected by the public, and I do feel like there wouldn't have been this element of, oh, you gotta respect Brian's game and give the win to Brian. I don't think that would have been the case here. But the thing is that both of these figures were relatively unpopular at the time. Obviously, Helen would be someone that would very easily win a public vote if she had gotten to the end, but she doesn't. So again, between Brian and Clay, I do feel like it's very tough to really pick here. However, I do lean towards Clay, just because I feel like Clay is a lot more relatable to the general public than Brian, where Brian obviously always comes off as super cold. And again, like, he does win challenges, he does dominate the game, and I do wonder if the public would have been able to respect that at the time. However, I do still lean more so towards Clay here. Next up, we have the Amazon, where we have Jenna versus Matthew, and this one's a pretty clear-cut one where, again, Matthew would have won. Like, we know from the time that the popularity polls that Matthew was number one on all of them, which is kind of surprising in retrospect, but still, in a public vote between Jenna, someone who was hated at the time, and Matthew, someone who was supposedly loved, I do think this would have been a clear-cut case. Next up, we have Survivor Pearl Islands, and this is a pretty difficult one here of Sandra versus Lil. Mainly because I don't feel like either of these were particularly popular figures. However, I do think it leans towards Sandra. Again, I do think Sandra was at least portrayed more positively on the show than Lil. And also, I feel like Lil's one of these people that, like, I could see the audience just being annoyed by the end of the season. And while, like, Sandra definitely gets her negativity here and there, and I don't think the public loved the Sandra at the time, I definitely feel like Sandra is more inclined to win a public vote at this point, so I did lean towards her. Next up, we have All Stars, where we have Rob versus Amber, and I do think the public would have voted for Rob. And like this one, we do have kind of proof for, at least in the fact that Bossa Rob did make the top 4 in America's Tribal Council, which very much implies that he was more favored than Amber. However, I do know at the time that there were definitely some detractors of Rob, and I could definitely see there being an anti-Rob sentiment from the public in voting for Amber. However, I am still more inclined to think that Rob would win this public vote. Next up, we do have Survivor Vanuatu, and I think this is kind of a tough one. Again, you got Chris versus Twyla. I would lean towards Chris. Again, obviously, Chris was a massive underdog at this point in the season, and I do feel like, obviously, that's something that the public would like. Like, while I think Chris just inherently is not someone that the public adores, I do think the storyline he has on the season does prop him up in terms of chances of winning a public vote, and also with Twyla having a lot of negativity surrounding her, I do lean towards Chris winning this vote here. Next up, we have Palau, where it's like, come on. It's Tom versus Katie, and obviously Tom wins. Tom was one of the most popular people to even play the game up until that point. And along with that, he was also someone that was very active in the game, won a whole bunch of challenges. And even the negatives you can call him out for now in terms of his misogyny at points, like that wasn't really a big deal at the time, from the audience at least. So I do feel like Tom is a clear-cut winner here. Next up for Guatemala, we have a bit of an interesting one where we have Danny versus Stephanie. However, I do feel like Stephanie wins this. Now, obviously, Stephanie gets a very negative edit on this season where Danny's is a bit more positive, and Danny, I do think, is also a person that wasn't hated by the public. However, I think Stephanie still wins just due to reputation. Obviously, Stephanie was one of the biggest heroes of the show up until this point. And despite all the negativity that she gets here, I do still think she had a massive fan base, and I do still think she wins this public vote. Next up, we have a tough one in Panama where we have Aris versus Danielle, and I don't think either of them are particularly likely winners in most scenarios. Like, again, I think Suri wins against any of them. I think Terry wins against any of them. But in this final two, I would lean towards Aris, mainly because, again, Aris is this young, attractive guy that I think the public would vote for. But is also someone that is good in challenges, was someone that rivaled Terry in challenges. Danielle had literally just taken out Terry, which is probably a knock for her as well. And also, I don't think Danielle was ever someone that was particularly well liked by the public. So again, I would lean towards Aris here. Next up for Cook Islands, we have a clear-cut answer by the fan favorite vote. Ozzy wins. Again, Ozzy, Yul, Becky, final 3. It would have been close between Ozzy and Yul. However, I do think Ozzy still ends up pulling it out. Again, he obviously pulled out the fan favorite award, so again, makes sense that he would win here. Next up, we have Survivor Fiji, where we have Earl, Cassandra, and Dreams. And I think Earl wins this. I doubt the public would have voted for Cassandra. I feel like Cassandra was never really shown too positively. And obviously Dreams had just had the Owlman situation. So I think this should be a pretty clear-cut case that Earl would win this, especially with Yao out of the picture, though I don't know how much the public was really loving Earl at the time, though. Next up, we have Survivor China. I think this is a brutal one, actually. I really don't know the right answer here. Obviously, Todd, Courtney, and Amanda. I think Todd was obviously portrayed very negatively throughout a lot of the season, but was portrayed as a very strong player. You have Courtney, who was a very snarky personality. However, I don't feel like that was as well respected at the time as it is now. And then you have Amanda, who is just kind of bland, but is also shown to be a decent all-around player. She is later going to be in contention for fan favorite in Micronesia, but I don't feel like she was that popular at the time of Survivor China. So I think this is a very tough one. I did end up siding with Amanda just because we know that Amanda was eventually a potential fan favorite. But to me, again, it is a tough one here, and I could see the argument for really any of the 3 winning here. But I decided to go with Amanda, though I can definitely see someone like a Todd winning, especially after he gets some personal content not too far away from the finale. And then for Micronesia, I kind of just spoiled it. Again, I do think Amanda beats Parvati in a public vote. Here, again, she was in contention for fan favorite, while Parvati wasn't. Parvati's edit was a lot more negative than Amanda's was as well, so I do think Amanda is the clear-cut winner here. Next up for Survivor Gabon, this one's very easy because we literally had a fan favorite award where Bob ends up winning. So again, Bob, Susie, Sugar, I think Bob is the clear winner, not really a question. Next up for Survivor Tocantins, same thing. JT won fan favorite. JT versus Steven, I'm pretty sure JT wins. Same thing goes for Survivor Samoa. Again, Natalie, Russell, Mick, final 3. Russell won fan favorite. I think Russell is the clear winner here, especially considering how ridiculous his edit was over the course of this season. And the same thing carries over to Survivor Heroes versus Villains, where we have Sandra, Parvati, and Russell. Russell won fan favorite that season. Again, very tough to believe that he wouldn't win a public vote here. So again, very clear one. Let's move on. Next up, we have Survivor Nicaragua, where again, I feel like this is a relatively easy one. Like, while there is no direct proof in terms of fan favorite awards to go by, the final 3 here was Fabio, Chase, and Sash. I think Fabio was the very clear favorite of the 3 from the public. Fabio was this likable underdog figure that ends up pulling out the win, while like Chase was shown as a bit of a doofus at points, and Sash was shown very negatively. So I do think Fabio was the clear-cut winner here. Next up for Survivor Redemption Island, clear-cut answer here. Boston Rob wins. Again, Boston Rob, Philip, Natalie. I mean, come on. Boston Rob's obviously winning this. And he ends up winning the fan favorite this season anyway. So again, very easy answer. Next up, we have Survivor South Pacific. And this one's a bit tougher, largely because the final 3 here is Sophie, Coach, and Albert. 3 people who weren't loved by the public. I do think it would have been between Sophie and Coach. However, the thing is that obviously Coach ends up being the you should have won guy by the end of this, but I do feel like there is a lot of negativity surrounding Coach to where I could definitely see the public not voting for him to win, especially considering like people didn't like him in Tocantins or Heroes vs. Villains. However, I just feel like through how dominant his gameplay was here and how little Sophie was shown on this season, I do still lean towards Coach. However, I think there is a world where Sophie could pull it out here. Next up, easy one. We have Survivor One World. Kim, Sabrina, Chelsea. Kim wins fan favorite. I think Kim is the very clear answer here. It's not even close. Next up for Survivor Philippines. This is another one where we have the fan favorite award kind of deciding it. Again, it is Denise, Scoop, and Lisa. Lisa ends up winning the fan favorite award this season. I think it's very clear that Lisa would probably win this public vote, though I do think there is an argument for Denise considering her story. However, again, considering the fan favorite vote literally went the other way, I feel like Lisa would still win. Next up for Kara Moen, and here, this should be a pretty clear-cut one as well. Again, Cochran, Don, Sherry. Cochran was someone that was a fan favorite back in South Pacific, and while he didn't end up being a top contender for this season, again, I feel like that still would have carried over, especially over Don, who had a decent share of negativity, and Sherry, who was pretty invisible. So again, I feel like Cochran is the clear answer here. Next up, we get to probably one of the tougher ones of the bunch, and that is Blood versus Water. And I really don't know where to go here, because like you have Tyson, Monica, Jervis, where I feel like Jervis is not winning, but between Tyson and Monica, I do think it's pretty close. Like obviously Tyson dominated the game, and I do think this is a point in Survivor where I do think the public would have respected gameplay, and I think that definitely would have leaned in his factor. However, I do think Monica was overall the more likable presence across the season, where again, Tyson was shown very negatively, and I remember at the time that people were not happy with Tyson winning this season. So I do think it is a question mark for me, and I actually lean towards Monica, especially with the fact that she does win a whole bunch of challenges along the way, has this storyline about wanting to differentiate herself from Brad, and I feel like just overall, Monica comes off as the more likable presence here, so I wouldn't be surprised if the public ended up voting for her. Next up, we have Survivor Cagayan, and we have Tony versus Wu, and this is kind of a similar case, where again, Tony very clearly played his ass off, played one of the best games in the history of the show, while Wu was just a much more likable figure to the audience there. And I feel like at the time, I do feel like Wu would have won a public vote. Especially when we're talking about the casual audience, I do feel like they were definitely more so in Wu's corner than Tony. And while I do feel like the super fan community definitely would have been pro Tony here, I do feel like Wu would have edged it out here. Next up, for Survivor San Juan del Sur, I think this is a pretty tough one, but here we do have Natalie versus Jacqueline versus Missy, and I do think it leans Natalie, actually quite a bit probably. Again, I don't think Missy is winning a public vote, so it is between Natalie and Jacqueline. And while Jacqueline has a decent story, I do think Natalie had a decent story of her own and also had some really strong gameplay along the way to where I do feel like the public would have sided with her. And I know RJP held a fan favorite vote at the time that Natalie ended up winning. So I would lean towards Natalie being the winner of this. Next up, we have Survivor Worlds Apart, and this one's clear. I think Mike wins this public vote. Obviously, Will was never winning. Will was not someone that was well respected by anyone. And between Mike and Carolyn, we have Mike being voted onto the second chance cast while Carolyn wasn't. So I think it's pretty clear that Mike was the bigger favorite there, and just inherently you would think so also. So I think that's a pretty clear-cut case. Next up, we have Survivor Cambodia, and I feel like this one is a bit tougher. Again, you have Jeremy, Spencer, and Tasha. And while like Tasha used to be a fan favorite at the time of Cagayan, that opinion had definitely soured by this point. So I do think it's between Jeremy and Spencer. And I would lean towards Spencer. I mean, this is a point where Spencer was still very, very popular from Cagayan. And while his content did get a bit negative during Cambodia, I do feel like his natural popularity would have still carried over here. So I would lean Spencer in this one, but I don't think it's 100% the case. Especially with Jeremy getting this content about him being a family man and a firefighter, and I think that's good content there. But again, I would still lean Spencer. Next up for Co-Wrong, we have Michelle versus Aubrey versus Ty. And this one's tough because I don't know who between Aubrey and Ty wins. Like, I'm pretty sure Michelle would not win a public vote at this point. However, again, I do feel like it is tough to pick out who between Aubrey or Ty wins. And to be honest, it might be enough that they split the vote to where Michelle possibly wins. But obviously at the time when Michelle won, people were saying, oh, Aubrey should have won. However, I do feel like Ty was just such a clear fan favorite figure from the casual standpoint. Then again, I could see both of them getting votes. However, again, Aubrey was still a relatively popular figure, and considering the super fan community was probably pro Aubrey at that point, I do feel like Aubrey edges it out, but I do think it is relatively close. Next up for Millennials vs. Gen X, we do have Adam versus Ken versus Hannah. Now, I think this one's kind of tough because, again, like you do have Adam, who is definitely given a lot of positive content, especially surrounding his mom having cancer, and also is a massive super fan of the show. However, I think in terms of the super fan community, I do think it would have been relatively split between Adam and Hannah. While I do feel like a lot of the casuals were pro Ken at this point. However, again, I do question, like, does the cancer storyline propel Adam to a win? As I do feel like it could. However, I just feel like from a natural standpoint that Ken was more so the casual fan favorite. And because I do lean Ken, but I can definitely see the argument for Adam being the winner here. Next up for Survivor Game Changers, we have a pretty tough one here in Sarah versus Brad versus Troyzan. Now, obviously, Troyzan's not winning. However, I think this is another situation where it's like, is the public going to respect gameplay? Because if they do, then they'll obviously go Sarah. Or are they going to respect like competition wins? In that case, they go Brad. Because it's not like any of these three were particularly likable. I mean, Troyzan was a top contender for fan favorite back in One World, but again, like barely gets an edit here. I don't think he's winning. Brad was someone that was very disliked during Blood vs. Water. And then Sarah was also not particularly liked over the course of this season by the casuals either. So it's, again, I think it's a tough one. I would lean towards Sarah, though, just because of how much game content she got. And I think this is a point in Survivor where when a certain player is so blatantly ahead gameplay-wise, I feel like the public would give it to them. So I do feel like I would lean towards a Sarah win here. Next up for HHH, and I think this one's easy. I mean, you got Ben, Chrissy, Ryan. I do think Ben wins the public vote here. I mean, yes, Chrissy would have been the favored person from the superfan community. However, I do feel like the casual audience was very pro Ben at this point, considering just him being this Marine, this person that was also an underdog by the end here that had to idle his way to the end. Again, I feel like he has a much more playable story, and I do think he would have won the public vote. Next up, we have Ghost Island. I think this one's a tough one between Dom and Wendell. I mean, obviously, Laurel's not winning here. But I would actually lean towards Dominic. I did do a bit of research for these later seasons in terms of looking up some popularity polls. And I did see a lot of polls that said who should have won between Wendell and Dominic, leaning in Dominic's direction. Now, I think if this was purely based on popularity, I do think they're relatively even. But I did see a lot more sentiment that Dominic played the better game. And because I did decide to lean Dominic here, but again, it really could go either way, and I don't think there is a solid answer. Next up, for David versus Goliath, I think we have a very difficult one here as well. And really, in general, I think a lot of the modern public votes here would be very difficult. But here we have Nick, Mike, and Angelina. And I think this would be a tough one because I do think the casual audience would have been more so in Nick's favor, but I could definitely see Mike getting some of the votes. However, I feel like the superfan community would have been pro Angelina at this point, if not maybe splitting a little bit towards Nick. And I feel like overall, I would say that Nick still wins here, because I can definitely see more of the superfans and the casuals voting for Nick. But I definitely know that there was a big portion of the superfan community that didn't want Nick to win here. But again, I just feel like Angelina was never winning a public vote. So again, I do lean towards Nick. Though I do feel like there are definitely other scenarios where Nick would probably lose. Next up, we have Edge of Extinction. I think this is probably the toughest one of the bunch to me, where I really have no clue who wins this. Again, you have Chris Underwood, someone that comes back into the game at the finale. And while he does play very hard at that point, he's literally someone that came back at the end, and I don't think the casuals would have been too happy with that. You have Gavin, someone who is shown as really passive throughout a lot of the game. Doesn't really get that much screen time in terms of things that he was actually doing out there. And then we have Julie, who is the most prominent of the three screen time wise, but is also the one that has the most negativity of the three. And I just feel like the public wouldn't have respected her either. So I think this is a tough one. I am leaning towards Gavin as the person that wins this. As again, I did decide again to look up some of the Facebook messages at the time. And again, there was a lot of anti-Chris sentiment that I don't think Chris would win. And between Julie and Gavin, I feel that Gavin is the more likely winner. So I did go with him. Next up, we do have IOI. And I think this one's pretty easy to me. I mean, obviously Tommy is someone that was very much portrayed as a winner candidate. However, I do feel like the public would have gone for Dean. Again, between Tommy, Dean, and Nora. And Nora was someone that was very disliked by the casuals. And while the super fans were loving Nora as a character, I don't think that's enough for her to win. And then between Tommy and Dean, again, I feel like Tommy is someone that was just kind of boring for most people, while Dean was someone that played very hard at the end. And I think definitely would have had more respect from the casuals. So I do think Dean is the easy answer here. Next up for Survivor, Winners at War. And this one's a tough one because I feel like all three of these people could win a public vote. You have Michelle, this massive underdog that gets all the way to the end and someone that was well liked by this point in Survivor history. You have Natalie, someone that dominated on the edge and was respected for being a physical presence while out there. And then you have Tony, who plays one of the most dominant games in the history of the show and would have been a very satisfying two-time winner. And I feel like, again, public vote-wise, I really don't know. I would lean towards Tony, but again, that's my own personal bias. It's obviously I would vote for Tony. However, I suspect that Tony would win, as again, the show was so much in the camp of showing how great of a player Tony is on this season, but I do think it is a question mark to where I don't fully know the answer. And now we're up to Survivor 41, where we do have Erica versus Deshawn versus Xander. And I think this one comes down to Erica and Xander. I did decide to look up some popularity polls here, both from the Reddit and some other sites as well. And I think that's probably the consensus. However, I think if we're going purely on casual votes, I think Xander's the clear winner here. I mean, I saw one poll where immediately after the Shan boot, Xander was at almost 70% popularity, with the next highest being at 9. So, I suspect that the casuals were very much in Xander's corner, and I do feel like he is the most likely winner in this scenario. Obviously being portrayed as an underdog the entire season, and someone that was also strategic within the game at points, to where, I feel like he definitely fits into this mold of the Malcolms, the Jays, the Aussies, these people that, again, would have won public votes had they been in one, and I feel like Xander fits in that mold, and I do think he probably wins here. But there we go. I mean, that is my thoughts on who would win a public vote for every season of Survivor. Obviously, stay tuned for more What If videos down the road, more general Survivor videos, casting videos, rankings. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.